Today, I'm going to discuss Abraham Lincoln's role as Commander-in-Chief of the United States and the tactics and approaches he favored in targeting the South during the Civil War. While not well known for military prowess, Lincoln was able to use his skills as a lawyer to beat the Confederate armies. According to Brown, military inexperience provides reason to seek wise counsel, but does not diminish the Commander-in-Chief's responsibility to fulfill these functions. Lincoln's sole military experience as a captain of the Illinois Militia during the Black Hawk War of 1832 was fleeting and superficial, yet he rose to the tasks required in far greater circumstances 30 years later. Brown is explaining how Lincoln's limited military experience should not be frowned upon. He may not have had the best experience, but when leading the Union's army 30 years later, his lack of military experience did not negatively impact his decision-making. Several key approaches helped manage the outcome of the war. One approach he initially favored in the beginning of his presidency was to take a calm but firm stance. This was evident at Fort Sumter, which was one of the first crises of his administration. Lincoln believed that if he had remained relaxed while maintaining a rigid stance, secession would no longer occur. He stated that he was willing to use force on Confederate states if they began seceding from the Union, and he vowed that he wouldn't strike the first blow. This approach proved to be misguided as he realized he had underestimated the gravity of the crisis and exaggerated the strength of Unionist sentiment in the South. South Carolina leader Jefferson Davis insisted the fort was their territory, and they demanded that federal troops evacuate it. Lincoln refused, but agreed to send provisions to Fort Sumter while not rearming the fort as long as it was not attacked. Davis ordered the bombardment of Fort Sumter if the federal troops did not evacuate immediately. The Union troops were outgunned and eventually evacuated. After the attack on Fort Sumter, there were fewer than 20,000 men in the U.S. Army, and many officers had resigned to join the Confederate Army. Lincoln revised his military strategy and came up with what was known as the Anaconda Plan. Similar to the huge snake that slowly suffocates his prey, Lincoln aimed to strangle the Confederacy. To do this, he blockaded southern ports and focused on seizing control of the Mississippi River in order to split the Confederacy. This plan was necessary after the loss of the Union at Fort Sumter. Lincoln needed to change his initial stance and had to act upon this issue with force. Another approach, which later proved unsuccessful, stemmed from Lincoln's belief that one decisive victory would crush the Confederate rebellion. However, such a victory proved elusive in part because Lincoln could not find the right commander. On July 16, 1861, General Irvin McDowell led approximately 35,000 Union soldiers into Virginia. Confederate General Thomas Stonewall Jackson held the line against the Union assault, and the Confederates' war whoop sent federal troops into retreat. The conflict would come to be known as the First Battle of Bull Run by the Union. The defeat at Bull Run taught Lincoln two things: he needed a better general, and he needed to learn military strategy. Lincoln, although inexperienced in actual military leadership, was often involved, some would even say over-involved, in his role as Commander-in-Chief of the Union. Lincoln's appointment of generals was a key approach in determining the outcome of the war. Today, we can analyze why Lincoln was roundly criticized through his correspondence with General George McClellan. In July 1861, Lincoln appointed General George McClellan to lead the main Union Army, which was called the Army of the Potomac. On November 1st, McClellan was promoted to General-in-Chief of the entire Union Army. When Lincoln explained the immensity of the task, McClellan exuded confidence. Although McClellan's Peninsula campaign included the intent to attack Richmond by land and water, he made very slow progress towards this goal. For months, Lincoln pressed McClellan to attack the enemy. For months, McClellan made excuses. Lincoln ordered the Army of the Potomac to march on Richmond by way of Manassas, with spontaneous operations by all units in Kentucky, on the Mississippi, and in the Gulf of Mexico. McClellan, however, had a plan of his own, not a frontal but flanking attack that would not only strike at Richmond, but would cut the rebels off, take all of Virginia, crush the Deep South, and end the rebellion. Lincoln believed that a multi-frontal attack would be best for capitulating the Confederacy, but McClellan was more cautious and preferred to surround the strategic sites of the Confederacy in order to weaken the rebellion before defeating them. In a letter from Lincoln to McClellan on October 13, 1862, Lincoln criticized McClellan's tactics and wanted him to be aggressive in his approach to attack the Confederacy. Lincoln's dissatisfaction is evident as he notes that McClellan is so cautious that he's not doing what the enemy is doing. McClellan was likely critical of Lincoln's approach because he believed that overcautiousness was key to defeating the enemy. Although Lincoln is not the most experienced military leader, he uses his great wealth of knowledge and common sense to try to convince the general to go forward with the attack based on the information known about the opposing army geographically. Lincoln also understood that it was the Confederate Army, not territory or the Confederate capital, that constituted the Confederacy's center of gravity. As he wrote to General Joseph Hooker in June 1863, "I think Lee's army, and not Richmond, is our true objective point." He understood the importance of the West and Union strategy. In early 1862, Union armies had employed the Tennessee River as the main line of operations to penetrate deep into western Tennessee and northern Mississippi, turning Confederate defenses on the Mississippi River and in Kentucky. Grant's subsequent victory at Shiloh permitted Union forces to seize major parts of the Confederacy's one remaining east-west railroad line and opened the way to both Vicksburg and the Chattanooga. The capture of Chattanooga permitted Union forces to penetrate the Appalachian Barrier and seize Atlanta. Lincoln was adept in recognizing the key geographic targets of the South and planned his offensive accordingly. Through the capable leadership of Generals Grant and Sherman, the Union was eventually able to score decisive victories to ruin the economic base which the South waged war on and emerged victorious. Lincoln is understood to be a much more brilliant military strategist than he is given credit for, and his choices in strategy and leadership enabled the Union to win the war. Additional pieces of Lincoln's strategy to defeat the Confederacy were by expanding the power of the executive branch. Some examples of expansion were claiming broad emergency powers that he argued the Constitution had vested in the executive branch. Lincoln called out the militia, authorizing increases in the size of the regular army and navy, expending funds for military purchases, deploying military forces, blockading southern ports, suspending the writ of habeas corpus in certain areas, authorizing arbitrary arrest, impaneling military tribunals to try civilians in occupied or contested areas. Lincoln assumed extrajudicial powers defending them due to said powers being used to fight a rebellion, and ordered everything that could possibly aid in defeating the Confederacy. Lincoln suspended habeas corpus and summarily swept 18,000 secessionists within those states into captivity, tipping a political balance that kept them in the Union. He intuitively understood that he could not simply leave the military to his own devices during war, because war involves the interplay of active wills. To conclude, Lincoln was seen as a capable military strategist, despite his background being that of a lawyer and not of a military officer. He took initiative and evolved his understanding of the South in order to fully comprehend how he would defeat the Confederates. His determination to succeed militarily, even while lacking experience, by creating novel ideas to create a functioning military unit allowed for his great success during the war. He used decisive reasoning to determine his operational strategy for the South. Thus, while Lincoln had originally underestimated the South's passion and military strength, he came to the realization that the South was determined to succeed, and so used his knowledge and clever tactics to ultimately defeat the South and preserve the Union.